see that the direction of the Sardinia attack is coming this way. Both sides were having a fairly long-range gun duel. So he's going to plug them in there in these fields here. They're going to go down this road, and they're going to be attacking. The French are going to be approaching this area from the valley to my right. And the Imperial Guard, along with the help of the First Corps, have nearly secured Solferino. What about Napoleon I versus Napoleon III? What are some of the big picture things that we should think about, and the differences between these two emperors?
Napoleon I was a soldier first and a statesman second. He was a military genius and had been a soldier since he was 9 years old. His prowess on the battlefield is well known. His ability to observe enemy deployments on a battlefield and to see their weakness was quite clear. This was called a coup d'oeil. He had the eye to determine where the enemy was weakest. And he was a charismatic leader who led men. Certainly in 1796, as a young General Bonaparte, he would lead men on foot. Even as emperor, he would lead his reserves on foot and lead them off to attack. So Napoleon's military genius, his personal bravery, and his successes were quite clear, and he always saw himself as a soldier, and in many ways on campaign lived like a soldier. Napoleon III was actually the opposite. He was a statesman first, and a soldier only in as much as he was a Bonaparte, but certainly not a soldier like his uncle. But the Second Empire actually lasts longer than the First Empire. And while Napoleon III has no desire to establish a European-wide empire like his uncle does, he is the person responsible for expanding the French overseas empire. Napoleon III is incredibly successful in the first decade of his reign. In fact, longer than that. He comes to power as president of the Second French Republic in December 1848. Then he becomes Emperor of the French in 1851, coronated in 1852, and remains emperor until September 1870. He reigns longer than his uncle, and from 1850 really until probably 1861, the Second French Empire, in its military power, in its naval power, in its economic power, is far greater in strength than what Napoleon I had done if we're looking at dollar for dollar or whatever, franc to franc. So we have this perception of Napoleon III as the Napoleon III of Sedan, of the Franco-Prussian War. And there's no question that the last decade of his reign was not as impressive as the first decade. But we have to understand that. So in 1859, Napoleon III is presiding over an empire that is wealthy, that is the second largest industrial power in Europe, that has the second largest navy in the world. The British have the first, and actually is a successful military power. They had won the Crimean War. They had almost twice as many forces in the Crimea as the British did, but the French contributions were far greater. And so the Second Empire and Napoleon III in 1859 is a very powerful, well-respected empire. It's not this empire of 1870 that falls within a matter of weeks. It is one of the great world powers at this time.
The Second War of Italian Unification was more than just the French involvement in those few months, but the French were only in the field for part of the war. We know Napoleon III ended France's participation prematurely, despite success in each battle leading up to Solferino. What happened?
There is a general misunderstanding of what happens at the end of, after Solferino. Because after Solferino we have Franz Joseph offers negotiations of peace settlement to Napoleon III. Napoleon III is quite receptive to a peace settlement, and that's ultimately signed at Villafranca in July 1859, about 2 weeks, right, 3 weeks or so after Solferino. It was July 11th, I think, if I'm not mistaken. What happens is that in the lead up to this war, Napoleon III does not want the other European powers to perceive his war in Italy as an attempt at Bonapartist expansion in Europe, because the international system that existed in Europe after 1815, the Congress of Vienna settlement, was structured to prevent a single power from threatening to dominate the European continent. And there was the principle of the concert of Europe, that there were certain rules of the game that had to be accepted. And so Napoleon III understood this very well. That's why he worked in concert with the British in the Crimean War against the Russians, who were perceived as threatening the balance of power in Eastern Europe, particularly the Middle East. Middle East and the Balkans. And Napoleon III, in preparation for this war, once it was decided that he was going to pursue this war, negotiated with the Russians a secret treaty in March, a full month before the war broke out, that the Russians would stay out of the conflict if a war broke out between France and Austria. And this was done because the Russians were very upset at the Austrians, who had been their allies until the Crimean War. And when the war broke out, Tsar Nicholas of Russia asked the Austrians to join him and provide support, and the Austrians refused. They refused because the war was not in Austria's interest, and Russia had been the aggressor. But the Russians see it as a betrayal because they had provided material assistance to Franz Joseph in 1849, 1850 to help him crush the Hungarian Revolution, and they wanted payback for it. And so the Russians see this opportunity of being neutral in a war between France and Austria as their way to get revenge on Austria, who they saw as betraying them in 1854-55 in the Crimean War. The British certainly were not happy about this conflict. Napoleon III did not enter an agreement with them. He would not let them know that there was an anticipated conflict, but certainly he did not want to disturb the British, who were his newfound ally. And we have to understand, we in general as students of history, that the animosity, the historical animosity and rivalry between France and Britain that begins way back since 1066 actually ends in the Crimean War when they become allies. And then France and Britain are allies from the Crimean War through World War II. And so if we look at the scope of history, it's very important for Napoleon III not to agitate the British, both because he's built this newfound friendship, but also he appreciates Britain's strength and doesn't want his empire to be seen as a threat. And so when we're looking at relationship with the Russians, you have this treaty in March. Napoleon III does not make a treaty with the British, but understands he has clear limitations. He does not negotiate with the Prussians on an agreement, but he knows that the Prussians and Austrians have very strained relationship, particularly after 1850, when the Austrians forced the Prussians to sign a treaty called the Treaty of Olmütz, in which the King of Prussia had to pledge that he had no designs on German unification. And this was very much a Godfather Luca Brasi treaty, where the Austrians, Franz Joseph, had threatened war with Prussia if the Prussians refused to sign, and the Prussians were in no condition to challenge Austria. And this upset the King of Prussia and the Prussian army, and so Napoleon III rightly concluded that a war between France and Austria might not be seen as a threat if done up to a limited extent. So all of this goes to say that Napoleon III did everything possible to lay the diplomatic groundwork before the war. Now this is done without those who he's negotiating with, who he signs treaty with, understanding the specifics of what his relationship with the Piedmontese are. And the Treaty of Plombières, The agreement that's made in October 1858 calls for the French to make common cause with the Piedmontese for the quote-unquote liberation of Lombardy and Venetia, which were two provinces that were united as the Kingdom of Lombardy-Venetia, part of the Austrian Empire. And it stated in the treaty that France would make common cause and not make a separate peace. But what happens is French armies are so successful at Magenta and so successful at Solferino that the German Confederation, which Austria was part of and Prussia was part of, and there were German princes that were part of it, were upset because the Austrian Empire, being part of the German Confederation, considered Lombardy part of the German Confederation, and the Austrians go to the German Confederation Diet and say the Confederation's been violated and we need to mobilize the forces of Germany. The Prussian king is not as interested, but the chief of staff of the Prussian army, a fellow named Helmut von Moltke, is very interested in mobilizing, is very interested in going to war with France, because the Prussians are always interested in going to war with France, and there is limited mobilization in Prussia. And the Russians also are a bit concerned because they got worried about how successful Napoleon III had been after Magenta and Solferino, and the Russians let the French know that while they have this treaty, they would not appreciate further operations of the French army. And the British, too, had made it clear. So what happens is Napoleon III, who's in the field at this time, is receiving word from Paris that the Russians, the Prussians, and the British are highly concerned about France's military successes, and that if the campaign continued into Venetia, that might mean an end to the Franco-Russian treaty, and it might cause other European powers to get involved. And so Napoleon III makes a very logical decision that while Lombardy has been liberated from the Austrians, he is not willing to risk a general European war over Venetia. And he explains this to Victor Emmanuel after Solferino, when it becomes clear in the weeks prior to Villafranca, and Victor Emmanuel understands. He's not happy, but he understands, because a general European war is not what Victor Emmanuel wants either. And so this agreement is reached, and the Peace of Villafranca is signed, and Victor Emmanuel has to accept it. Camillo de Cavour, the prime minister, is furious. In fact, Victor Emmanuel says to Napoleon III, he's more upset about having to be the one to tell Cavour that this treaty, and Cavour is so angry, eventually resigns over it. Giuseppe Garibaldi, the great Italian revolutionary who's fighting, who's commanding troops in the Alps, is furious and sees it as a betrayal. But the reality is that Napoleon III makes a very cold, realistic decision to end the conflict, because a general European war would not have resulted in anything anyone had wanted, and at least Napoleon III gets a victory, and at least half of northern Italy is liberated.
So the second war for Italian unification, how does it actually end a year and a half or so later?
The Peace of Villafranca ends the conflict between Austria and France, and with the understanding that Lombardy will be ceded by the French to Piedmont. Franz Joseph absolutely, positively refuses to cede the territory directly to Lombardy. And so even though Victor Emmanuel later is willing to pay the Austrians for their official recognition, Franz Joseph refuses and will not accept it until 1866, after the Third War of Italian Unification. So the French and Austrians are out. Napoleon III, as part of Plombières, not everything is free, nothing is free, and part of the agreement required Victor Emmanuel to cede to France the Duchy of Savoy, which actually was the inherited lands of the House of Savoy, that was the ruling house of Piedmont, but they were willing to do that in order to get French support to help unify Italy, and the county of Nice, the city of Nice and the region around it. Both Savoy and Nice were ethnic French primarily. And Napoleon III, that is ceded, it's given over to France, but Victor Emmanuel and the Piedmontese military leadership and the Piedmontese parliament and Italian nationalists and the Piedmontese army decide that this is not going to be the end of that phase. And in 1860, they occupy Tuscany, Parma, Modena, and the Papal Marches in the north. They occupy those regions. They do this through a variety of means. There's a Tuscan revolution. There's a revolution in Parma and Modena and the Papal Marches. Now, these revolutions are sort of revolutions. The Tuscans certainly had supported, Tuscan revolutionists supported the Piedmontese cause, or Italian unification cause. These revolutionaries wanted to join with Piedmont, and so they had demonstrations and sort of had these riots, but they did it in such a way that the Piedmontese would send troops into Tuscany, Modena, and Parma, and the Papal Marches under the guise of restoring order and preventing revolution. And then what they end up doing is annexing this territory. So they have, by 1860, central Italy, north central Italy is annexed. But this leaves the kingdom of Naples and two of the two Sicilies, Naples in the south. We have the Papal States, particularly Umbria and Marca in Umbria, I should say, in central Italy, the Papal States that remain under Pope Pius IX. And what is decided is that by May of 1860, is Giuseppe Garibaldi decides to raise volunteers and conduct a campaign to conquer southern Italy. There had been a revolution in Sicily. He had been petitioned by Italian nationalists that were part of what was called the National Society for Italian Unification to take volunteers, land in Sicily, support the revolution, and overthrow the Neapolitan, the Bourbon government of the King of Naples. This had been done in coordination with the Piedmontese and Victor Emmanuel. But the problem was that it could not be forecast, or broadcast, I should say, that Garibaldi's volunteers were basically doing the bidding of himself with the active support of the Piedmontese. And so he goes off with his 1,000 volunteers, the 1,000, on two broken down Piedmontese steamships. They leave from Genoa in May 1860, and within a matter of 3 months conquer the island of Sicily. But what's very interesting is over the course of the summer of 1860, as part of the conquest of Sicily, new volunteers begin to arrive almost daily from Piedmont, 500 men, 1,000 men on a ship, and these ships are showing up in Palermo, and these troops are getting off. And what this is, quite simply, are Piedmontese volunteers, but these are volunteers from the Piedmontese army. Troops in the Piedmontese army were told that if they wished to resign from the Piedmontese army and volunteer for service in Sicily and support Garibaldi, that would be permitted. And about 20,000 of them do. But it becomes so clear to everyone observing, foreign observers, that Cavour, who has returned by this time as prime minister, has to tell the Garibaldini that they have to sort of tone it down. And there were Garibaldini within the Piedmontese army who were officers in the Piedmontese army who had served under Garibaldi in 1859 campaign. And so you have this sort of coordinated, sort of clandestine operation in which the Piedmontese, supported by led by Garibaldi and Garibaldini and revolutionaries, take Sicily, cross into Naples, conquer Naples, and Cavour and Victor Emmanuel then, in order to stop the spread of Garibaldi's revolution, march into the Papal States. And they occupy the Papal States except for Rome, the city of Rome. This had been also negotiated with Napoleon III in 1860, who conceded to not intervene as long as Rome was left alone under the Pope, and there was a French garrison there as well. And Victor Emmanuel says fine, and so we have this conquest of Naples. We have Piedmontese troops invade the Papal States and fight a very brief campaign, and in October 1860, Garibaldi and Victor Emmanuel meet at Teano and shake hands, and Garibaldi gives over command of his army and all the territory that he controls, which is Naples and Sicily, to Victor Emmanuel, and you have de facto Italian unification, which is made in February 1861 de jure with the official annexation. And that leaves Rome and Venetia outside of unified Italy, in 1861. And those territories will not become part of a unified Italy until 1866 and 1870, respectively.
Among historians and/or enthusiasts, what do these well-informed people miss about the campaign and the battle itself?
One of the greatest problems with studying the Second War of Italian Unification and the campaign of 1859 is in the scope of 19th century military history, and in the scope of modern military history, it is very rapidly subordinated to the wars of German unification. You have 1866, which is the Austro-Prussian War, is also the third war of Italian unification. Italy's on the same side as the Prussians. But the Prussian victories in 1866 over the Austrians and the Prusso-German victory over the French in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 are so dramatic and so decisive that they overshadow anything that happens in 1859. And so when we look at the historical narratives and analysis in the 19th century military histories, it tends to go Napoleonic Wars, Wars of German Unification, skipping over 1859. But the reality is that Moltke, the chief of the Prussian General Staff, later German General Staff, is studying very carefully what was going on in 1859. He was particularly focused on French mobilization, use of steam power ships, use of railroads and logistics. There is a Prussian General Staff study that was conducted right after the Second War of Italian Unification, and that will be published, in fact, in French and German and Italian by 1862, 1863 on the war itself. So what Moltke will learn is these issues of mobilization and movement. He also studies carefully the nature of French army leadership and Austrian army leadership, because the Prussians are going to fight at some point, he knows, against the Austrians and then probably the French. And so this campaign is critical in Moltke learning what he needs to learn and then implementing what needs to be implemented in order for there to be a decisive campaign in 1866 and a decisive campaign in 1870. And what I tend to tell historians, and I've given talks on the Risorgimento and its place in military history, and what I conclude with is that the sum of 19th century military history is based upon the parts, and that we can't just get caught up in the macro narrative because the micro makes up the macro. And to skip over 1859, we're skipping over the largest war and the largest battles fought on the European continent since the Napoleonic Wars. And these were not just battles in passing. You have, at Solferino, so many casualties. The Red Cross is created as a result. Henri Dunant is there and shocked at it. The casualties from Montebello and Palestro are so great. You've got railroad cars filled with casualties going to hospitals all over Italy. The lethality of war in the age of industrialization is quite clear at this time. And when we study the Crimean War, we tend to look at, let's say, the disease, because disease was the greatest killer in the Crimean War. But when we look at 1859, casualties from rifled muskets are enormous. There is no major impact of disease at the time because of the speed of the campaign. But the campaign's pretty darn fast. The war is declared April 23rd, and by July 11th, we have Villafranca. That's a pretty decisive campaign for two major empires fighting with their best armies. So I think that military historians and students of history tend to look at what they consider more sexy, which is the wars of German unification. But the wars of German unification wouldn't have been what they were without the experience of 1859.